He thought she disappeared the night he erased her. But some names don't vanish, they wait. The chandeliers of the Whitmore Foundation Gala spilled golden light across polished marble floors, the low hum of wealth and quiet ambition filling the room like a steady pulse. And at the center of it all stood Daniel Whitmore, perfectly composed in a custom tuxedo, one hand resting lightly at the small of his fiancée's back as cameras flashed and guests leaned in, eager to orbit his success, his voice smooth, controlled, as he spoke about legacy, about growth, about the future he was building, a future where there was no trace of the woman he had left behind, no mention of the night he signed her out of his life like a bad investment. And for a moment, it seemed flawless, seamless, complete, until the sound outside shifted, subtle at first, the faint roll of engines cutting through the curated elegance, and then louder, deliberate, impossible to ignore, as a line of black cars pulled up one by one beneath the grand entrance, their glossy surfaces reflecting the lights like mirrors, conversations faltering mid-sentence as heads turned, as curiosity replaced confidence, as something unplanned entered a room designed for control, Daniel's smile tightening just slightly, almost imperceptibly, as he followed the direction of every gaze, watching as the doors opened and a driver stepped forward, then another, and then her, stepping out with a quiet kind of certainty that didn't ask for attention but commanded it anyway. Emily Carter, dressed in soft ivory, nothing flashy, nothing loud. Yet every eye found her, because she didn't hesitate, didn't shrink, didn't look like someone who had been erased. And beside her, 3 small children walked in step, their tiny shoes tapping against stone, their identical features catching the light, each one carrying a presence far bigger than their size. And the room stilled, the air thinning as recognition spread in waves, because they had his eyes, his posture, his unmistakable imprint. And for the first time that evening, Daniel Whitmore stopped speaking, the words dissolving before they could leave his lips, his world, so carefully constructed, shifting on its axis as Emily lifted her gaze, meeting his across the crowd, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something far quieter, far more unsettling. A calm that came from knowing something he did not, and as she stepped forward, the soft echo of her heels marking each second, a man in a tailored charcoal suit moved to her side, his presence authoritative, composed, and when he spoke, his voice carried just enough to reach the edges of the room. "Miss Carter, your family is ready." And it was that word, family, that landed heavier than anything else, because Daniel knew families like that. The kind that didn't announce themselves unless they intended to change everything. And as the crowd shifted, as whispers sharpened into realization, as the weight of power quietly rearranged the room, Emily didn't look back, didn't explain, didn't need to, because she had already arrived as something he no longer understood, and standing there beneath the lights, surrounded by everything he thought defined success, Daniel felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, not fear, not yet, but the undeniable sense that the story he believed he had finished had only just begun. The truth is, he did not leave her because she was weak. He left because she saw through him. The memory did not come back all at once. It slipped in like a draft through a closed window, quiet but impossible to ignore, pulling the air from Emily's lungs as the past unfolded behind her steady gaze at the gala. Because 6 months ago there had been no chandeliers, no polished marble, only the sterile white glow of a hospital room where time stretched in slow, unforgiving seconds. The sharp scent of antiseptic clinging to everything as 3 newborn cries filled the space with fragile life, and Emily, pale and exhausted, lay back against thin pillows, her fingers trembling as she reached for the tiny hands placed gently beside her. Each child impossibly small, impossibly real, and for a moment, despite the pain, despite the fear, there had been something sacred in the silence that followed, something pure, until the door opened and shattered it, not with anger, not with chaos, but with something colder, something practiced. Daniel Whitmore did not rush to her side, did not look at the children, did not even step fully into the room. He stood near the door as if proximity itself was a negotiation, his suit immaculate, his expression unreadable, and behind him, a man in a gray suit held a folder, thick, deliberate, final. And when Daniel finally spoke, his voice carried no warmth, no hesitation, just a clean, surgical distance. "This is not going to work," he said, as if discussing a contract, as if the life they had built could be summarized in a single line. Emily blinked slowly, trying to process words that did not belong in that room, not next to the soft breaths of their children, not after everything she had given up to stand beside him when he had nothing but ambition and a borrowed office. Her voice barely above a whisper. "Daniel, they are your children." But he did not look at them, his eyes fixed somewhere past her, somewhere safer. "And that is exactly the problem," he replied, each word measured, calculated. "I cannot build what I am building with this." And he gestured slightly, not quite toward the babies, not quite toward her, just enough to make the meaning unmistakable. The man beside him stepped forward, placing the folder on the table with a soft, final sound, the kind that echoed longer than it should. "A separation agreement," the man explained calmly, as if this were routine, as if women were dismissed from lives like files archived and forgotten. "This ensures a smooth transition." Emily stared at the papers, the words blurring as her heart pounded against her ribs. She had stood by Daniel when investors laughed at him, when the numbers did not add up, when the world refused to see what he insisted he could become, and now, at the moment she needed him most, he had already moved on, already decided she no longer fit the version of success he wanted to present. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the bed, knuckles paling, as she searched his face for something, anything that resembled the man she had loved. But there was nothing there, only distance, only ambition sharpened into something unrecognizable. "You are strong," he added, almost as an afterthought, as if offering a compliment could soften the precision of what he was doing. "You will figure it out." And with that, he turned, not waiting for a response, not giving her the dignity of a goodbye, the door closing behind him with a quiet click that felt louder than any shout. And in the silence that followed, broken only by the soft, uneven breathing of three newborns, Emily Carter understood something she would never forget. He had not left because he could not stay. He had left because, in his world, she no longer mattered. And yet, as her hand moved instinctively to rest over the three tiny lives beside her, something else took root beneath the pain, something quieter, something unbreakable, because even then, even in that moment, he had no idea what he had just walked away from. He believed silence meant weakness, but silence was where she rebuilt everything he destroyed. The nights that followed were not dramatic, not loud, not worthy of headlines or sympathy. They were quiet in a way that pressed against the walls, filled with the soft rhythm of three newborn breaths and the constant, low hum of uncertainty that never fully disappeared. The small apartment Emily moved into barely stretched 800 square feet, its windows facing a narrow street where the light felt dim even at noon. The kind of place no one noticed, which was exactly why she chose it. Because there was no audience here, no expectations, no version of her that needed to perform. Only survival measured in ounces of formula, hours of broken sleep, and the steady discipline of showing up again and again when exhaustion tried to convince her otherwise. Her days blurred together, feeding one child while rocking another with her foot, memorizing the different tones of their cries, learning that strength did not look like grand gestures, but like staying awake when her body begged to shut down. And yet, even in that small, quiet life, the world Daniel built kept reaching for her in subtle, deliberate ways, his name appearing on television screens mounted above grocery store aisles, his voice echoing through interviews about innovation and vision, his face framed by success that seemed untouched by the life he had walked away from. And sometimes, strangers would glance at her, then at the news, then back again, as if trying to place a memory they could not quite confirm, and she would lower her gaze, not out of shame, but out of choice, because she refused to be a footnote in his story. The letters came next, clean envelopes with precise lettering, each one carrying the same underlying message wrapped in different words, offers of financial support in exchange for distance, suggestions framed as concern, proposals that spoke of convenience and practicality, as if motherhood could be negotiated like a business arrangement. She read them once, then folded them carefully, placing them in a drawer she never opened again, because every line confirmed what she already knew. He wanted control without responsibility, presence without consequence, and she would give him neither. There were moments, of course, when the weight of it all pressed harder, when the quiet felt too heavy and the future too uncertain. When she stood at the window holding one of the babies and wondered how far she could go on determination alone. But then there were other moments, quieter still, when one of them would curl their tiny fingers around hers, or fall asleep against her shoulder with complete trust. And in those seconds, something inside her settled, something steady and unshakable. She was no longer waiting for anything from him, not apology, not acknowledgement, not even regret, because the life growing in that small apartment did not need his permission to exist. And somewhere between those sleepless nights and early morning light, Emily Carter stopped being the woman he left behind and became something else entirely, someone who understood that loss was not always an ending. Sometimes it was a clearing, a space where something stronger could take root. And as winter gave way to spring, as the city outside slowly softened, there came a morning that felt different, not because anything had visibly changed, but because something had shifted beneath the surface, a quiet certainty she could not yet name, until the sound of engines rolled into her street, slow, deliberate, unmistakable. And when she looked out the window, the sight waiting below did not belong to the life she had been living, a line of black cars, polished and still, as if they had been there all along, just waiting for the moment she was ready to see them. Power does not always knock. Sometimes it arrives and waits to see if you recognize it. Emily stood by the window, the morning light pale against her skin, one hand resting gently on the back of the worn couch where two of the babies slept, the third cradled against her shoulder, his small breath warm and steady. And for a moment she did not move, did not rush, did not assume, because life had taught her that sudden changes often carried hidden costs. But the cars remained, silent, patient, their presence too deliberate to ignore. And then the first door opened, slow and precise. A man stepping out in a tailored dark suit that seemed untouched by the dust of the street, his posture straight, his movements controlled, not hurried, not uncertain, as if time adjusted itself around him rather than the other way around. He looked up, meeting her gaze through the glass with a calm recognition that sent a quiet tension through her chest. Not fear, not quite, but awareness, the kind that told her this moment had been set in motion. Long before she noticed it, she shifted slightly, adjusting the baby in her arms, her fingers instinctively tightening just enough to ground herself. And after a brief pause, she moved, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a measured decision that echoed the way she had rebuilt everything. Step by step, she made her way downstairs, the hallway dim and narrow, the faint echo of her footsteps marking each second as something irreversible. When she opened the door, the air outside felt different, sharper somehow, as if the world had tilted without asking permission. The man inclined his head slightly, respectful but not submissive. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice smooth, practiced, carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard, not questioned. She did not respond immediately, her eyes scanning the scene, the line of vehicles, the drivers standing at a careful distance, the absence of chaos, of spectacle, everything controlled, intentional. "You have the wrong person," she said finally, her tone even, not defensive, just factual, because for months she had been no one, intentionally invisible. And people like this did not come looking for women who had nothing. But the man's expression did not change. If anything, it softened slightly, not with doubt, but with certainty. "We do not," he replied, reaching into his jacket and producing a slim folder. The movement slow enough to be non-threatening, deliberate enough to be unmistakable. "You are Emily Carter, daughter of Margaret Carter, granddaughter of Harrison Carter." The names landed differently than anything she had heard in months, not because they were unfamiliar, but because of how long they had been buried, pushed aside, reduced to fragments of a past she had been told no longer mattered. Her breath caught, subtle but undeniable, as the pieces she had spent years ignoring began to surface. Her mother's quiet insistence that some doors should remain closed, the absence of extended family, the careful avoidance of certain conversations, details that once felt like omissions now aligning into something larger, something she had not been meant to see. "That is not possible," she said. But the certainty in her voice had thinned, replaced by something quieter, something searching. The man extended the folder, not forcing it into her hands, simply offering. "It is not only possible, Miss Carter, it is documented." She hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking it, the paper cool against her fingertips, heavier than its weight suggested. As she opened it, the world around her seemed to narrow, the street fading into background noise as lines of ink confirmed what her mind was still trying to reject. Records, signatures, dates that connected her to something far beyond the life she had been living, far beyond the man who believed he had defined her worth. And when she looked up again, the man was still watching her, not impatient, not surprised, as if he had seen this moment before in others. "Your grandfather has been searching for you for years," he said quietly. "He would like to meet his family." The word lingered in the air, heavier now, layered with meaning that extended beyond blood, beyond names. Emily glanced back at the apartment window, where 3 small lives waited, unaware that the world beneath them was shifting. And for the first time since that night in the hospital, something unfamiliar moved through her chest. Not pain, not uncertainty, but possibility, vast and unsettling and undeniable. And as the line between the life she had survived and the one waiting in front of her began to blur, she realized something Daniel Whitmore never could. He did not abandon a woman with nothing. He walked away from a future he was never meant to control. Sometimes the life you thought you lost is only the version that was too small for you. Emily did not answer immediately, the folder still open in her hands, the weight of it settling deeper with every passing second as the morning air shifted around her, quiet but charged, as if the street itself was holding its breath. She looked down again at the documents, at the name Harrison Carter printed in a way that carried history, not just identity, a name she had heard only in fragments. Growing up, always followed by silence, by a change of subject, by her mother's soft insistence that some pasts were better left untouched. And yet here it was, no longer distant, no longer avoidable, standing in front of her in polished black metal and quiet authority. She closed the folder slowly, her fingers steady now, not because the truth was easy to accept, but because something inside her had already begun to align with it. The man waited without pressure, without urgency, as if he understood that this moment was not about convincing her, but about allowing her to recognize what had always been hers. Emily lifted her gaze, her eyes clear, searching his face not for reassurance, but for truth. "Why now?" she asked, her voice calm but layered with the question beneath the question. "Why after all these years? Why after everything?" The man inclined his head slightly, as if acknowledging the weight of it. "Because until recently, you did not want to be found," he said, and the answer landed with a quiet precision that made her chest tighten. Because he was right, not in a way she had ever admitted out loud, but in the choices she had made, the distance she had kept, the way she had built a life small enough to feel safe, contained enough to avoid the kind of attention that came with names like Carter. And then the babies came, and everything changed, not just her circumstances, but her definition of what mattered. She glanced up at the window again, where behind the glass, 3 small lives existed without knowing the scale of what was unfolding. And for the first time, the question was not whether she wanted this, but whether she could afford to refuse it. The man followed her gaze, understanding without needing explanation. "He is not asking for anything from you," he added quietly. "Only the opportunity to know his family." And there it was again, that word, family. No longer abstract, no longer complicated, but immediate, tangible, tied to the 3 children upstairs who deserved more than survival, more than quiet resilience. They deserved choice, possibility, a future not limited by the decisions of a man who had already proven he would walk away. Emily exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that did not release tension but transformed it. Her grip on the folder relaxed, not in surrender, but in acceptance of something larger than fear. She stepped back slightly, not retreating, but creating space to think clearly, to see beyond the moment, beyond the shock. And when she spoke again, her voice carried something new, not hesitation, not defiance, but clarity. "I will meet him," she said, the words simple but irreversible. The man nodded once, as if this had always been the outcome. not because it was expected, but because it was inevitable. Of course, he replied, stepping aside just enough to reveal the open door of one of the cars, the interior dark, refined. Waiting, Emily did not move toward it immediately. Instead, she turned back toward the building, toward the narrow staircase, toward the life she had built with her own hands. Because she was not leaving it behind, she was bringing it with her, every sleepless night, every quiet decision, every moment she chose to keep going when it would have been easier not to. She climbed the stairs with steady steps, her heartbeat no longer uncertain, but measured, grounded. And when she reached the door and stepped inside, the familiar space no longer felt small, it felt complete, because it had carried her to this moment. She gathered her children one by one, holding each of them close, not as something fragile, but as something powerful. And as she stepped back out into the morning light, into the presence of something far bigger than the life she had known, Emily Carter understood with absolute certainty she was not being rescued. She was being recognized. A new life does not begin when you step into it. It begins the moment you decide you deserve it. The car door closed with a soft, final sound that seemed to separate everything Emily had known from everything waiting ahead. The quiet hum of the engine replacing the distant noise of the street as the vehicle moved forward, smooth and controlled, as if even the road had been prepared for this moment. Inside, the air was cool, faintly scented with leather and something understated yet expensive, the kind of detail that did not demand attention but quietly confirmed it. Emily sat with one child in her arms while the other two rested in specially prepared seats beside her, their small movements grounding her in something real as the world outside shifted, buildings changing from worn brick to polished glass, the city rearranging itself in a way that felt both unfamiliar and inevitable. She did not ask questions right away, not because she did not have them, but because she understood that answers carried weight, and once spoken, they could not be undone. Instead, she watched, absorbing, measuring, allowing the reality of it to settle in layers rather than all at once. The man across from her remained composed, his posture relaxed but attentive, as if he was not escorting her, but accompanying her, a distinction that mattered more than it appeared. After several minutes, he spoke, his tone respectful, steady. "Your grandfather built his company over 5 decades, he said, not as a boast, but as context. He is not a man who makes impulsive decisions." Emily shifted slightly, adjusting the baby against her shoulder, her gaze moving from the passing skyline back to him. "And yet he waited this long," she replied, her voice calm, not accusatory, just precise. The man nodded once, accepting the truth in her words. "Because he believed your mother's choice deserved respect," he said. "She wanted distance from that world, and he honored it, even when it cost him his family." The answer lingered, heavier than expected, because it reframed something Emily had carried for years without fully understanding: her mother's quiet life, the absence of extended relatives, the unspoken boundaries that had shaped her childhood. None of it had been neglect, it had been a decision, deliberate and protective. And now that decision had reached its limit. The car slowed as it approached a gated entrance. The transition from city to something more private marked not by noise, but by stillness. The gates opened without hesitation, revealing a long drive lined with trees that seemed untouched by time, their branches arching overhead like a passage rather than a path. Emily felt a subtle shift in her chest, not fear, not doubt, but awareness of scale, of history, of stepping into something that had existed long before her and would continue long after. The car came to a stop in front of a structure that did not need to declare its significance because it carried it in every detail. The kind of place where power was not displayed, it was assumed. The door opened, and the man stepped out first, turning to offer his hand not out of necessity, but out of respect. Emily took it, not because she needed support, but because she understood the drawn not by curiosity, but by instinct. And when he saw them, really saw them, the composure he had held so carefully faltered, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who did not know what to look for, but enough to reveal the depth beneath it. "My great-grandchildren," he said quietly, the words carrying a weight that settled into the space between them, not as a claim, but as an acknowledgement of something that could no longer be denied. Emily felt something tighten in her chest. Not resistance, not fear, but the unfamiliar pull of connection, complicated and incomplete, yet real. She shifted slightly, allowing him to see them more clearly, not offering, not withholding, simply allowing the truth to exist in front of them both. He stepped closer then, slowly, as if aware that proximity needed to be earned, not assumed, his hand lifting just slightly before stopping, a question unspoken, a boundary respected. Emily noticed, and in that moment, something small but significant settled into place. He was not like the man who had walked away without looking back. He understood that presence required permission. She nodded once, subtle but clear, and only then did he allow his hand to gently rest against the smallest child's back, his touch careful, reverent, as if holding something far more fragile than it appeared. "You have her strength," he said, his voice softer now, carrying a note that belonged to memory rather than observation. Emily knew who he meant without needing clarification. Her mother, the woman who had chosen distance over power, silence over influence. And in that moment, the past did not feel like something hidden anymore. It felt like something unfolding, piece by piece. She wanted a different life. Emily said quietly, not as a defense, but as truth. He nodded, the movement slow, weighted with understanding. "And I respected that," he replied, "even when it meant losing you." The admission did not come easily, but it came. Without excuse, without justification, just fact. And that, more than anything, shifted something in Emily's perception, because accountability, quiet and unadorned, was something she had learned not to expect. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, layered with everything that had not been said for years, and yet, standing there, with 3 small lives between them and a history that could no longer remain distant, Emily realized that this was not about rewriting the past. It was about deciding what came next, and as she met his gaze again, steady and clear, she understood that for the first time, she was not being asked to fit into someone else's world. She was being invited to shape her own. The moment you realize you were never small is the moment the world starts to rearrange itself around you. The doors behind them opened without a sound, revealing an interior that did not overwhelm with excess but commanded with precision, every detail intentional, every line clean, the kind of space where decisions were made quietly and carried weight far beyond the room itself. Emily stepped inside with steady movements, the children close against her, their soft presence grounding her as unfamiliar surroundings unfolded. The air was warmer here, carrying a subtle scent of polished wood and something timeless, not new, not artificial, but enduring. Harrison Carter walked beside her now, not ahead, not leading, but matching her pace in a way that spoke of something shifting, something equalizing. And as they moved deeper into the estate, the scale of it became clearer, not through size alone, but through history embedded in every surface, photographs lining the walls, not of public triumphs, but of quiet moments, generations captured in fragments that told a story of continuity, rather than display. Emily's gaze lingered on them as she passed, not searching for recognition, but understanding the weight of what she was stepping into, a legacy that had existed without her, and yet had never been complete. They entered a large room flooded with natural light, floor-to-ceiling windows opening to a landscape that stretched farther than the eye could comfortably follow. And for a brief second, the contrast struck her. Months ago, her world had been confined to narrow walls and measured survival. Now it expanded in ways that felt almost unreal. But she did not let it overwhelm her, because she understood something now that she had not before. Space did not define her. She defined how she moved within it. Harrison paused, turning to face her fully, his expression no longer guarded, but open in a way that carried both authority and something far more human. "Everything here," he said quietly, his voice steady, "is yours as much as it is mine." The words were not grand, not dramatic, but they landed with a force that settled deep, not because of what they offered, but because of what they acknowledged. Emily did not respond immediately, her eyes moving slowly across the room, absorbing the meaning behind the statement rather than the statement itself. Ownership was not something she had sought, not something she had measured her worth by, but recognition. That was different. Recognition meant she had never been outside of this world, only apart from it, one of the babies. Stirred softly, and she adjusted her hold, her attention returning to what anchored her in every moment. Harrison noticed, his gaze softening again as he stepped closer. They will never have to wonder where they belong, he added, and there was no promise in his tone, only certainty, the kind built over decades, not declared in a moment. Emily met his eyes then, steady, clear, and for the first time since she arrived, she allowed a small shift in her posture, not defensive, not guarded, but grounded in something new, something that felt less like stepping into the unknown and more like reclaiming something that had always been hers. And yet, even as that realization settled, another thought surfaced, quiet but undeniable, because this was not just about what she had gained, it was about what had been taken, not by chance, not by fate, but by a man who believed he understood value, who believed he could decide what mattered and what did not. And as that thought lingered, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with clarity, Emily Carter understood that this was not the end of her story. It was the moment it began to intersect with his again. Only this time, the balance had changed completely. Power is not proven when you rise. It is proven when the ones who dismissed you are forced to stand in your shadow. The days that followed did not rush forward. They unfolded with a quiet precision that felt unfamiliar at first, as if time itself had slowed to allow Emily to adjust to the scale of her new reality. The estate did not overwhelm her, because she refused to be overwhelmed. She moved through it the same way she had moved through her smallest apartment, aware, intentional, grounded, the children's presence anchoring every decision, every step. And yet, beyond the walls of that quiet world, something else had already begun to shift, because names like Harrison Carter did not exist in isolation. They moved markets, shaped narratives, influenced the very spaces Daniel Whitmore had spent years trying to dominate. And it did not take long for those currents to reach him. It began subtly, a delayed response from a major investor, a meeting rescheduled without explanation, a tone in the room that felt slightly less certain than before. The kind of change most would ignore, but Daniel was not most. People, he noticed patterns, disruptions, small fractures in systems he believed he controlled. And when the first report crossed his desk with a familiar name attached, Carter Holdings, his hand stilled for just a fraction of a second, not long enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough for something deeper to register, because Carter was not just another entity. It was a presence, one that had existed long before him and would continue long after. His jaw tightened slightly as he scanned the details, the connection indirect but unmistakable, a partnership realignment, a strategic interest in sectors his company relied on, nothing aggressive, nothing overt, just enough to shift the balance in ways that could not be ignored. Across the city, in a room filled with quiet light and uninterrupted space, Emily sat near the window, the children resting peacefully nearby, their soft breaths a steady rhythm against the silence. A tablet lay on the table in front of her, its screen displaying information that, weeks ago, would have meant nothing, but now unfolded with clarity, each line connecting to a system she was beginning to understand, not because she had been trained for it, but because something in her recognized it. Patterns, decisions, the subtle ways power moved without announcing itself. Harrison stood a few feet away, watching without intrusion, his presence steady, not directing, not instructing, allowing her to find her own footing within a world that had always been hers by name, if not by experience. "You do not have to rush," he said quietly, his voice carrying no pressure, only certainty. Emily glanced up, her expression calm, focused. "I am not rushing," she replied. And it was true, because this was not about catching up. It was about stepping into alignment, about understanding not just what she had gained, but what it meant, what it required. The screen shifted as new data appeared, a notification tied to Daniel's company, a movement in stock value, small but noticeable, the kind of fluctuation that did not cause panic but invited attention. Emily studied it for a moment, not with emotion, not with anger, but with a clarity that felt almost detached, because this was no longer personal in the way it once had been. It was structural, inevitable, a consequence of choices made long before she ever stepped into this space. Harrison followed her gaze, understanding without explanation. "He built something impressive," he said. acknowledging the truth without hesitation. Emily nodded slightly, not dismissing it, not diminishing it. Yes, she said softly, her eyes returning to the screen. But he built it on the assumption that I would never stand here. The words were not bitter, not sharp. They were simply accurate, and that accuracy carried more weight than any accusation ever could. The room fell quiet again, but this time, the silence felt different, not like absence, but like preparation, like the moment before something shifts permanently. And as Emily reached out to close the screen, her reflection faintly visible against the glass, she realized that this was not about reclaiming anything he had taken. It was about revealing what he had never understood, and somewhere across the city, in an office built on certainty, Daniel Whitmore was beginning to feel it, not as a confrontation, not yet, but as a change in the air. Subtle, undeniable, and impossible to reverse. He built his empire on certainty, but certainty is the first thing to collapse when truth walks into the room. The invitation arrived without ceremony. A single envelope placed neatly on Daniel Whitmore's desk among contracts and projections that had once defined his control, its paper heavier than the rest, its presence subtle but impossible to ignore. He noticed it immediately, not because it demanded attention, but because it did not need to. His fingers paused for a fraction of a second before lifting it. The room around him continuing its quiet rhythm of efficiency, assistants moving, screens glowing, the distant murmur of deals in motion. But for Daniel, everything narrowed to the weight of that envelope in his hand. He opened it with the same precision he applied to everything else, expecting strategy, negotiation, something he could anticipate, something he could manage, but what he found inside did not fit into any of those categories. A formal invitation, understated, direct, requesting his presence at a private gathering hosted by Carter Holdings. No explanation, no negotiation, just a date, a time, and a location he recognized immediately, not because he had been there, but because of what it represented. His jaw tightened slightly, the smallest shift in an otherwise controlled expression. Carter Holdings did not extend invitations lightly, and when they did, it was never without purpose. Across the city, Emily stood before a mirror that did not distort, did not flatter, did not reduce. It simply reflected, and for the first time in a long time, she saw herself without the weight of someone else's expectations. The room behind her quiet, the children resting peacefully, their presence no longer fragile, but steady, a constant reminder of what she had carried through every moment of uncertainty. She adjusted the sleeve of her dress, not for appearance, but for comfort, for alignment, because this was not about becoming someone new. It was about standing fully as who she had already become. Harrison entered without interruption, his presence familiar now, not overwhelming, not distant, just present. He will come, he said, not as speculation, but as fact. Emily met his gaze through the reflection, her expression calm, unreadable in a way that was no longer defensive, but intentional. I know, she replied, her voice even, because men like Daniel did not ignore shifts in power. They moved toward them, trying to understand, to regain control, even when control was no longer theirs to claim. The evening unfolded with the same quiet precision that had defined everything since she arrived. The setting prepared not to impress, but to establish a space where every detail reinforced something unspoken yet undeniable. When Daniel stepped into that room, he did not hesitate. He never did. But something in the air was different, not hostile, not confrontational, just altered, as if the rules he had relied on no longer fully applied. Conversations paused subtly, attention shifting in ways that were not obvious but impossible to ignore. And then he saw her, not across a crowded space, not hidden within movement, but standing exactly where she needed to be, composed, steady, unchanged, and yet entirely transformed. Emily Carter did not move toward him, did not acknowledge him immediately. She did not need to, because the shift had already occurred. Because for the first time since the night he walked away, he was the one entering her world. And as his gaze fixed on her, recognition sharp and undeniable, the distance between what he believed and what stood in front of him collapsed in a single, irreversible moment. She turned then, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough, her eyes meeting his with a calm that carried no accusation, no need for explanation, only truth, and in that silence, heavier than any words he could have prepared. For Daniel Whitmore understood something he had never accounted for. She had not returned to confront him. She had returned because she no longer needed to. The most dangerous moment is not when the truth is revealed, but when it is recognized by the one who tried to bury it. The room did not erupt. It did not gasp or shift dramatically, because power at this level never announced itself with noise. It revealed itself in silence, in the way conversations paused half a second too long, in the way eyes moved without turning heads, in the way presence alone recalibrated the space, and Daniel Whitmore felt it before he fully understood it. That subtle but undeniable shift where he was no longer the center of gravity. His posture remained unchanged, his expression controlled, but something beneath it had begun to fracture, not visibly, not yet, but enough to unsettle the precision he relied on. He took a step forward, then another, each movement deliberate, calculated, as if proximity could restore clarity, could return the situation to something he could define, something he could manage. But with every step, the reality in front of him sharpened, not softened. Emily Carter stood exactly as she had when she turned to face him, composed, still, not waiting, not reacting, simply present, and that presence unsettled him more than any confrontation ever could, because there was no entry point, no weakness to exploit, no emotion to redirect, only a calm that existed entirely outside of his influence. "Emily," he said finally, her name leaving his lips with a familiarity that no longer belonged to him. She did not respond immediately, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, and in that brief silence, something unfamiliar passed between them. Not tension, not anger, but distance, clear and irreversible. "Daniel," she replied, her voice even, polite, but stripped of everything that had once connected them. No warmth, no history, just acknowledgement, and for the first time, he felt it, not as a thought, but as a realization that settled into his chest with quiet certainty. He had lost something he could not quantify, something he could not reclaim through strategy or persuasion. His eyes moved slightly, taking in the details around her, the environment, the people who moved with purpose but without deference, the subtle alignment of everything that pointed to one truth he could no longer ignore. She was not here as a guest. She was part of the structure itself. "I was not aware," he began, his voice measured, carefully neutral, "that you were involved with Carter Holdings." The words were chosen with precision, an attempt to reframe, to regain footing, to bring the conversation back into familiar territory. But Emily did not follow. She did not adjust. She did not engage on his terms. "You were not meant to be," she replied, not sharply, not dismissively, just truthfully. And that truth landed heavier than anything else in the room, because it carried no intent to impress, no need to justify, only fact. Daniel held her gaze for a moment longer, searching, recalculating, trying to find the version of her he had known, the one who would have responded differently, who would have explained, defended, reacted, but she was not there. And the absence of that version was more disorienting than any change he could see. "You should have told me," he said, the statement slipping out before it could be refined, and the moment it did, he understood the mistake, because the assumption behind it no longer applied. Emily's expression did not change, but something in her eyes clarified, not anger, not hurt, but distance sharpened into something precise. "There was nothing to tell," she said calmly. "You made your decision with all the information you thought you needed." The words were not an attack. They were a mirror, reflecting his own certainty back at him, stripped of its advantage. And in that reflection, for the first time, Daniel Whitmore saw the full shape of what he had done, not as a mistake, not as a miscalculation, but as a choice that had consequences beyond his control. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was definitive, a line drawn without being spoken. And as Emily turned her attention slightly away, not dismissing him, but no longer centering him, Daniel understood something he had never experienced before. This was not a situation to fix, not a negotiation to win, not a narrative to control. This was an outcome, already decided, already unfolding, and for the first time in his life, He was not the one shaping it. Closure does not come from what is said. It comes from what no longer needs to be. The room continued to move around them, but not in the way it had before. Conversations resumed, glasses lifted, quiet laughter returned, yet the shift remained, subtle and permanent, like a line drawn beneath everything that had just occurred. Daniel Whitmore stood where he was for a moment longer, not frozen, not defeated, but recalibrating, his mind working through outcomes, variables, possibilities. Because that was what he had always done. He adapted, he adjusted, he found leverage where others saw limits. And yet this time, there was nothing to leverage, no angle to exploit, no version of the situation that returned control to him. Emily Carter had removed herself from the framework entirely. She was no longer part of his equation, and that absence created something he could not solve. Across from him, Emily did not watch him, did not measure his reaction, because she did not need to. She had already moved past the moment where his response defined anything for her. Instead, her attention shifted naturally, effortlessly, to the people around her, to conversations that did not carry tension, to a space where she existed without being reduced to someone's past. Harrison stood nearby, not intervening, not directing, simply observing with the quiet awareness of someone who understood the significance of what had just unfolded, not as confrontation, but as resolution. The kind that did not require agreement to be final. A server passed with a tray, the soft clink of glass barely audible, and Emily accepted one. Not for the gesture, but for the normalcy of it, the grounding simplicity of an action that belonged entirely to the present. Daniel stepped forward once more, not with the same certainty as before, but with a measured intention, stopping at a distance that no longer felt negotiable. "Emily," he said again, softer this time, not as a claim, but as a request for something undefined. She turned slightly, acknowledging him without inviting him closer, and in that small movement, the boundaries between them became clear, visible without needing explanation. "I did not know," he said, the words quieter now, stripped of the authority they once carried. And for the first time, there was something else beneath them, not regret in the way it was often performed, but recognition, late and incomplete, that his certainty had not been knowledge, it had been assumption. Emily regarded him for a brief moment, her expression unchanged, not unkind, not dismissive, simply steady. "No," she said calmly, "you did not." And that was all. No elaboration, no extension, because nothing more was required. The truth had already settled between them, complete in its simplicity. Daniel held her gaze for a second longer, as if waiting for something that did not come, an opening, a shift, a return to something familiar. But there was none, only the quiet clarity of a reality he could not alter, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, he nodded, not in agreement, not in acceptance, but in acknowledgement of something he could no longer deny. He stepped back then, not retreating, but repositioning, understanding, perhaps for the first time, that this was not a space he could occupy in the way he once had. Emily watched him go only for a moment before turning away fully, her attention returning to the life in front of her, not behind. The children were not here, but their presence remained with her, shaping every decision, every step, and as she moved through the room, no longer observed but recognized, no longer questioned but understood, she realized something that did not need to be spoken. This was not victory in the way the world defined it. It was something quieter, something stronger, the restoration of balance, the quiet return of everything that had once been taken without permission. And in that stillness, surrounded by a world that finally matched her worth, Emily Carter did not feel the need to look back, because the chapter she had closed no longer had any claim on the life she was now living. In the end, it was never about proving anything to him. It was about finally seeing herself clearly. The night did not end with a grand gesture or a final confrontation. It softened instead, like the quiet settling of something that had been in motion for far too long. The lights of the estate casting a warm glow across the landscape as guests gradually dispersed, conversations fading into distant murmurs, leaving behind a stillness that felt earned rather than empty. Emily stepped outside, the cool air brushing gently against her skin, grounding her in the present moment. far removed from the version of herself that once stood in a hospital room questioning what she had lost. She moved with ease now, not because everything was resolved, but because she no longer needed resolution to feel complete. Behind her, through the tall windows, the reflection of the evening lingered, silhouettes moving, power shifting, a world continuing its quiet rhythm, but none of it pulled at her the way it once might have. Because her center had changed, Harrison joined her after a moment, not interrupting, not filling the silence, simply standing beside her as the night stretched out before them. "You handled that well," he said, his voice calm, carrying no surprise, only recognition. Emily allowed a small breath to leave her, not tension, but release. "It was not difficult," she replied, and it was the truth, not because the past no longer mattered, but because it no longer held power over her. The difference was subtle but absolute. Harrison studied her quietly, seeing not the uncertainty he might have expected, but something far steadier, something that had not been given to her by this world, but built long before she stepped into it. "You remind me of her," he said after a moment, and Emily knew he meant her mother, the woman who had chosen distance over influence, who had walked away not because she could not stay, but because she understood what staying would cost. Emily nodded slightly, her gaze lifting toward the horizon where the city lights flickered in the distance, a world she had once believed defined everything. "She taught me what mattered," she said softly, and for a moment, the past and present aligned, not in conflict, but in understanding, a foundation that had carried her through every version of herself. Inside, somewhere beyond the walls, Daniel Whitmore would continue his life, his business, his carefully constructed world, but it no longer intersected with hers in any meaningful way, not because she had forced the distance, but because it had revealed itself naturally, the separation complete without needing to be declared. Emily turned slightly, her thoughts returning to what mattered now, to the 3 small lives waiting for her, to the future that no longer felt uncertain, but open, expansive in a way she could finally step into without hesitation. She did not need to look back, not because she was avoiding anything, but because there was nothing left behind that required her attention. Everything she needed had come with her, had been built within her, and as she walked forward, the quiet strength in each step undeniable, Emily Carter understood something that no one else in that room fully could. She had not become powerful overnight. She had simply returned to a truth that had always been there, waiting for her to claim it. And somewhere, in a world that once believed it had defined her, her absence spoke louder than any presence ever could, because she had not come back to prove anything. She had come back as something undeniable, something complete, and in that quiet certainty, her story did not end with him. It finally began without him.